to Hoplite. If that were the case, then trying to take him out from range would be difficult. An entire magazine couldn't even make it past that dervish of metal. The chains didn't even look a single bit worse for wear. An effect of their magic, perhaps. Perhaps one of the squad's casters could find a way to make it through, or maybe CQB would fare better in this battle. Tolak pointed again, giving a wide, toothy grin as he shouted, "Smother!" With that, the gargantuan fiend took a lumbering step forward, its smaller kin pooling out toward Hoplite like a tainted river, trampling one another in their eagerness to rip into his flesh. He magnetized the visors to his back, instead gripping the Magnus before bringing it to bear, backing away as he took aim. He hoped dearly that he wouldn't have to use every single shell, but the horde seemed to stretch back farther than he could see. This was going to be a long day. Chapter 9. Dragon's Curiosity. The Dragon of the East stared down at the looming horde of fiends, a sneer forming on his face as his slitted golden eyes glared down upon the mass of putrid purple flesh. Invisible to all forms of detection, Legolanthus floated downward, closer to this Scarlus's creature. Aside from the curse, the man didn't look extraordinary. A lean warrior's build and a plain face. Nothing of note aside from the chains bound to his forearms. Tolak was certainly not the same. Scarlus's Legolanthus had met in his youth, that was for sure. Time had slowed for him, as it always had once he focused in on something, making the charging fiend seem to be moving at a leisurely pace. If he wanted to, he could exterminate these vermin from the face of Akulis with but a wave of his hand, and the urge to do so was nearly overwhelming. But he needed to stay his hand for now. Hoplite still hadn't expressed any draconic powers from what he had observed. The dragon respected the man's discipline, but other than that there was nothing that spoke of Hoplite possessing dragon blood. Likely another one of the trickster god's deceptions, designed to fill Legolanthus' mind with paranoia and fear. There was no other dragon of Dekuma besides himself, and the banished child could not have returned. If that creature had... Well, Legolanthus doubted that he'd still be alive. Despite his doubts, however, the dragon had found himself enthralled by Hoplite. There was something oddly familiar about the mortal, something that hearkened him back to simpler times. Perhaps it was the cold, calculating demeanor. Perhaps it was of his inordinate size and armaments. But something about him drew the curiosity. These past few days spent skulking in the shadows had provided him only limited insight into the man's true nature. He knew that he was pale as a ghost beneath that plate armor, as if he rarely, if ever, saw the sun. Legolanthus had also learned that Hoplite possessed the golden eyes of a dragon, yet they were not slitted, as his own were. There were other bloodlines on Akulis that could cause the eyes to yellow like that. Perhaps he was... Wolfborn? If that were so, where was his pack? He'd not have wanted to separate it from them. If that were the case, Wolfborn were much like the Athier that way. None of these others bore wolf eyes. It was impossible for them to be in a pack. No, he couldn't be Wolfborn, but neither could he be half-dragon. Legolanthus had not fostered any half-breeds for centuries, and he'd not pursued the pleasures of the flesh in that same time frame. That ruled out the possibility of Hoplite being his long-lost son. Unless, could he be a descendant? His children had fostered their own young over the years, diluting his divine blood as the age continued on. Yet that seemed unlikely. If Hoplite was truly of distant relation, he'd be smaller. His eyes would be a standard shade, and he would carry himself with far less pride. The more he thought on it, the more Legolanthus began to suspect that what Mayzik had claimed could be true. There was only one way to know of Hoplite's lineage for certain, and that would be to spill his blood. If it dripped hot like magma, then Legolanthus would know for certain that the banished child had returned. Perhaps this coming battle would provide the dragon with the answers he so dearly seeks. He'd been away from the East for far too long. His people needed him to return. Chapter 10. Scar the Fiends tore a path forward, snarling and rabid, ready to tear into his flesh for a chance at easing their pains. As the tidal wave of flesh moved forth, Hoplite's perception of time slowed, allowing him to consider his options. He could fall back to get a better position, holding up inside the rest stop along with the others. If he did that, however, it would be more difficult to finish off Tolak. The mutant would be able to sit outside the tunnel comfortably, while his minions whittled away at the party. Perhaps it would be best to engage him here after all. These standard fiends would be unable to harm Hoplite. The most they could do was get in his way. There was also the matter of the massive fiend that still loomed above the horde, staring dumbly ahead. It towered over Hoplite by at least 2 feet, with arms and legs as broad as tree trunks. It was almost certainly a lesser threat than Tolak. A simple bullet to the brain would incapacitate it permanently, though the orc seemed to be almost docile. Hoplite took aim with the visors anyway, pulling the trigger and sending the bullet flying towards the giant's skull. The bullet collided with the orc's forehead, knocking its head back and causing it to stumble, yet it did not fall. Hoplite had heard a plink through the cacophony of roaring voices, and the beast's head returned, clutching its skull with a weeping cry. Was this creature like Tuji, with skin like steel? If that were the case, then overwhelming it with a barrage of bullets would have to be the solution. If he caused the fiend enough pain, it would collapse into a useless husk, no matter how tough its skin. He flicked the visors to semi-auto, firing 2 bursts aimed at the beast's knees. Tolak, however, leapt to intercept, almost too fast for his eyes to track. The chains whipped forth, knocking all 6 bullets off course and into the surrounding fiends. Tot landed, darting toward Hoplite with a wide grin on his face. He was far faster than the surrounding fiends, closing the distance between himself and Hoplite within only a few seconds. He put away the visors, pulling free the Sectus as Tolak finally came within range. The 2 chains whipped forth at blinding speed, narrowly missing his helmet as he ducked, thrusting toward Tolak's chest. The mutant sidestepped the blow, twisting around with a punch aimed squarely for Hoplite's head. He seized the fist, but before Hoplite could apply pressure to shatter the hand, Tolak took a deep breath. Somehow his hand phased through Hoplite's gauntlet, becoming transparent before solidifying again. Tolak cackled as he backflipped away, landing cleanly in front of his horde before they parted around him. The creatures charged Hoplite with mad fervor, and he met them with fist and blade. Going for vitals would prove to be a waste of effort. Striking them anywhere would be enough to put them down. Fist crushed skull, Sectus parted cursed flesh, all blows landing indiscriminately at the grasping flesh around him. Only a few seconds had passed, and already a circle of gore and twitching limbs surrounded him. At some point, he had grabbed a beefier fiend by the wrist, flinging the mutant around to knock away its comrades. This proved to be wonderfully effective, often sending the surrounding creatures flying into one another and causing more injury. Ham! Ow! Tolak shouted from the crowd, crushed the others, I will deal with this one. A loud guttural roar answered the order, and Hoplite could see the giant fiend trampling over its fellows, charging towards the rest stop. He could see no one else but Michael standing there, frustratingly motionless, as the Marine stared blankly at the tunnel's interior. Before Hoplite could shout an order, however, Michael seemed to steel himself. Charging into the tunnel after clicking on his headlamp, Hoplite reared back, planting his foot firmly on the stone behind him, before he flung the bloodied remains of his improvised fiend toward the towering beast. The projectile's lower half was almost completely gone. Nothing but bone and shreds of muscle remained, the guts flapping in the wind as it flew toward its target like a rocket. Again, Tolak leapt, but Hoplite, who had anticipated the motion, lashed out with his free hand, jumping to meet the fiend in midair. A single chain struck the flying husk off course, causing it to narrowly miss the orb. Instead, the unfortunate creature collided headfirst with the stone barrier rail, splattering on impact like a fly on a windshield. Hoplite's hand lashed out again, looking to crush Tolak's windpipe with a quick squeeze. Again, Tolak took a deep breath, his form once again becoming incorporeal for but an instant. Hoplite's hand passed through the shimmering form as if it were air, and then the chains came for it. A barrage of blows struck his shields, once, twice, 5 times, even more, until finally they burst, all in the span of a second. Hoplite collided with the ground, rolling with his momentum to come up standing. Tolak greeted his vision, standing tall with his arms crossed, that increasingly irritating grin still on his face. Why was it that this expression seemed to irk him so? He never used to care about such trifling things. No matter. Now was not the time to think on it. Something more pressing needed thought. Hoplite was certain that he had just found a weakness in that last exchange, one that he could take advantage of when the positioning was just right. The chains didn't seem to deflect blows from up close, meaning that close quarters were necessary. If he could close the distance again, he could pull out the Fortis and blast Tolak's head off before he could become transparent. It seemed that ability was activated by a sharp intake of breath. If he could get a shot off before the fiend could do that, then he'd be neutralized. Hoplite darted forward again, eliminating the fiends that had filled the gap between the two of them before again. He thrusted for Tolak's heart. His hand reached down toward the Fortis as he did so, pulling the magnum free before quickly taking aim. Just as planned, bullet tore through skull. The problem was, it was the wrong head that had been splattered. Tolak had forgone his strange breath magic, instead opting to dodge the blade, thrust, counter-striking with firm fingertips. He had not struck Hoplite, though, but rather the barrel of the Fortis itself, knocking its aim off center right as he had pulled the trigger. It seemed like a risky move on his part. Would it not be better to simply phase again? Tolak couldn't have known what Hoplite had planned, so perhaps there was a short period of time where he couldn't phase after using. If that were the case, then if he overwhelmed the fiend with blows, then eventually one would hit. All Hoplite needed to ensure his victory was to land just one clean hit. The pain would slow Tolak down enough for further damage to be inflicted. Tolak backpedaled as Hoplite slashed, a tense look on his face as he barely managed to dodge Hoplite's flurry of blows. It felt strangely satisfying to see the damnable smirk wiped from the creature's expression. This show of emotion seemed to prove his theory. There was a window between his phases that Hoplite could take advantage of. This fight was as good as finished. Tolak was incredibly fast, able to dodge every single blow from Hoplite, but he was clearly on the ropes. Talk had clearly never faced anyone as deft as himself before. Hoplite was certain that he would have been able to land a hit a while ago if not for the dozens of fiends that still pooled around him. They kept absorbing blows that may have been able to clip Tolak, getting in the way as they scrambled to either move past or latch onto him. They barely slowed him down, true, but those few instants were crucial in aiding Tolek's survival. Again, Tolek phased, backflipping through the air. Hoplite fired the Fortis, the bullet speeding toward the solidifying form before being deftly deflected by one of his chains. This was proving to be a most frustrating encounter. Never before had all his attacks been made ineffective like this. It made his face hot with rage. It took a great effort to cool the heat of his anger, but his icy discipline eventually won out. Was he too far outside of Twindle's range for her aura to affect him? It was possible. He charged at a gasping Tolek, flattening the fiends that flooded his path with ease as he bore down on the smaller man. This needed to end now. He was certain that he'd manage to get the mutant eventually, but the squad didn't have that long before they'd be overrun. If he could incapacitate Tolak, then the fiends would revert to their normal state, i.e., charging the nearest uninfected individual. That wouldn't do anything to pull the mutants already in the tunnel away. But the greater horde out here would be compelled to pursue Hoplite. They just needed to hold out until then, and based off the dozens of lights emanating from the tunnel, they were doing fairly well. The giant was nowhere in sight, meaning that it must have entered the rest stop. Hopefully they had taken care of that one already, but only time would tell. He stabbed at Tolek again, and the fiend ducked, but instead of backpedaling, he retaliated. His chains whipped at Hoplite in a flurry, quickly bursting his shields again before one wrapped around his throat. Tolek laughed madly as